If you think that we Finns do just mobile games for casual audiences, you couldn't be more mistaken. You wanna know more? Stay tuned. Howdy ho, and welcome back to Retro Games in Rally English. My name is Juho Puorikoski, I'm a Finnish journalist and a non-fiction author, and I'm here to talk about old games in my very Finnish English. This video is special, for we are about to dive deep into the primordial ooze of Finnish game industry. I'm going to tell you a story about a game that in certain extent laid the foundation of game development here in Finland. This video is a story about 3 individual games that form a trilogy of sorts. And those games are Stardust, Super Stardust and Super Stardust HD. So, let's fasten our seatbelts, blast into orbit and obliterate asteroids into Stardust. Developed by Bloodhouse and released by Team 17 for Amiga in 1993, Stardust is a pretty straightforward clone of Atari's legendary Asteroids. The game captures the arcadey feel of Atari's vector-based space mayhem pretty well, and thanks to quite self-explanatory gameplay, you're pretty much set by just grabbing the joystick. In a minimalistic backstory, evil Professor Shomund, who is a blue penguin by the way, has kidnapped Princess Voilevi, who is named after a Finnish butter brand, and threatens to conquer the whole galaxy. His minions have disguised themselves as asteroids, and only one brave space pilot can stand up to this galactic menace. The story is irrelevant, but it's presented in a similar manner as the title crawl of Star Wars movies. In 1994, Bloodhouse developed a sequel titled Super Stardust for Amiga 1200, Amiga CD32 and PC. Instead of a true sequel, the game is a graphics upgrade as gameplay remains virtually unaltered. The visual tuning makes the game look even more pretty. The pre-rendered graphics and smooth animation are a prime example of the technical skills of the small team behind these 2 games. Super Stardust is also the first Finnish console game, as it was released for the Commodore's infamous Amiga CD32. In the narrow game library of this financial disaster, Super Stardust stands out in a very positive way. The third Stardust game was released in 2007 for PlayStation 3 as a digitally downloadable title. This is not exactly retro, but the game deserves a mention as it revamped the gameplay and audio visuals by providing one of the best arcade experiences on a home console. As is the case with its predecessors, the third Stardust is an excellent example of fast-paced gameplay combined with beautiful audio visuals. Super Stardust HD is a retro game by gameplay. It's easy to pick up, but hard to master. The learning curve isn't as steep as in the 2 older titles, but the game forces you to learn and master the game mechanics if you wish to venture beyond the first few levels. In this age of tutorials and games that practically play themselves, it's wonderful to play something like the original Stardust. The difficulty level is borderline depressing, as the game forces you to learn more than just the basics of the gameplay. But once you get the hang of it, you can almost taste the euphoria. If you're a game designer, take notes. It's wonderful when the game doesn't underestimate the player. If Atari's original Asteroids is a familiar concept, the core gameplay in all 3 Stardusts offers few surprises. The objective is to clear the screen from space debris by blasting big pieces of rocks into smaller pieces and eventually to rubble, or stardust. If you exit the screen, you reappear from the other side. This is important to remember when you're navigating your way through the asteroid minefield. As these space cookies crumble to smaller targets, there's more to shoot at. And on top of that, the little ones travel faster than the sluggish mommy asteroids where they originate from. To make matters worse, enemies appear at random and you have to defeat the boss after every 6 levels. You'll get weapon upgrades at a steady pace, and there's a teeny weeny bit of tactics involved, as some weapons are more effective than others on different type of space rocks and enemies. After the boss is defeated, it's time to warp to the next cluster of levels. This is where the first 2 Stardusts break away from the original Asteroids. Instead of top-down view and relatively slow-paced gameplay, the camera is situated behind thrusters in a third-person perspective. The task is to clear a wormhole of clutter and steer away from minefields. These warp sequences looked absolutely amazing when the game was released, and the awesomeness hasn't faded. These levels are spectacular, especially in the first Stardust. Getting these 3-dimensional sequences running like this, while maintaining an illusion that these are actual 3D graphics, is an achievement to be proud of. You also get access to voluntary special levels, where you can collect some extra lives, but these mazes are basically just death traps that will deplete your lives and make you feel miserable. They utilize the physics and game mechanics from Lunar Lander, so you'll have to acquire more fuel from time to time and fight against gravity that is constantly pulling you towards the bottom of the screen. These special levels are reminiscent of the cave flyer genre, which was rather popular here in Finland at the 90s. Stardust has also one of the top-tier soundtracks of Amiga games. Beats generate pressure and tension and feed the arcade feel just the right way. Excellent score became somewhat of a hallmark for the other games from the same developers. Modern games hoard gigabytes upon gigabytes of space, but games of the yesteryears had to cram themselves to as little space as possible. Stardust is packed on 3 Amiga floppy disks in just a few megabytes. Just think about it. A single cell phone photo occupies the same amount of space. The game also runs flawlessly on a basic configuration of Amiga 500. The code is optimized extremely well. As I mentioned earlier, the difficulty level is quite brutal. The game isn't that challenging when compared to other similar titles of the same era, but the control methods of the 90s cough up some extra challenge, which is a little bit harder to digest. Almost every modern shooter benefits from a gamepad that has buttons more than fingers and 2 analog sticks for movement. In the age of Amiga and other home computers, things were different. The basic method for controlling most of the games was a joystick that had a stick twisting in 4 directions and a single fire button. Controls were always a compromise of sorts, and Stardust isn't any different. The flight model is somewhat Newtonian. Pushing the stick up will generate thrust, while left and right changes directions. Stopping the ship is done by reversing direction and engaging thrusters. Pulling the joystick down will activate shields, and that will give you some protection from the debris. The game also utilizes keyboard, as pausing and opening the weapons menu were too much for a single button joystick. The ship is totally maneuverable, but rewiring your synapses from modern controls to those of the 90s is, for me at least, somewhat of a chore. But in some regard, it's like riding a bicycle. You never really forget the skills, you'll just have to find them again. But I have to admit that I'm extremely bad at these kinds of games. As a kid, I had no problems plowing through these levels, but at this age, things are very different. Super Stardust HD is of course totally different in controls. The game uses the dual-stick gamepad to full extent, as the left stick controls the ship and the right one the direction where you're firing at. These Robotron-style controls work like a charm, as they feel very intuitive and responsive. Because of this, gameplay is way faster when compared to the 2 predecessors, yet the difficulty level is substantially lower. The evolution of Stardust in the standpoint of gameplay is very interesting. The modern controls made it possible to ramp up speed, but at the same time the game is easier. Every incarnation of Stardust is a fine arcade shooter in its own right. While the Wheels of Time have been merciful for the first 2 in regards of the audio visuals, the gameplay is somewhat of a mixed bag. This is because of the hardware rather than game design. When comparing Stardust and Super Stardust to other games of the Amiga library, the Finns hold their ground. Stardust isn't the first internationally successful Finnish game, but it is a very important milestone. In the beginning, the game development here in Finland was primarily in the hands of tech-savvy amateurs. But the commercial release of Bloodhouse's game galvanized the brewing game scene. These were the first steps Finland took towards Max Payne, Angry Birds and other phenomenal success stories. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Finnish game industry wasn't even at an infant stage. There were some commercial games released for Commodore 64 and international market, but those games were made primarily by gifted individuals such as Jukka Tapanimäki and Stavros Fasolas. As the processing power of home computers grew when Amiga and Atari ST were released, it became increasingly harder to make games as a solo project. Teamwork was required, and this gave birth to the first game studios in Finland. The early days of Finnish game development are closely tied to demo scene, a subculture of computer enthusiasts who concentrated on creating demos, non-interactive, real-time audiovisual pieces of art. Demos in this context are not to be confused with trial versions of games. The demos that scene produced measured the pure processing power of computer systems. They squeezed the last ounces of performance in order to mesmerize the viewers with elaborate programming and audiovisual flair. Adding interactivity to demos was somewhat of a logical next step. A demo group named Bloodhouse, led by Harri Tikkanen, had a nifty graphics routine which was then adapted to an arcade game reminiscent of Atari's Asteroids. Stardust was born. The work started as a hobby project in 1992 with no dreams of commercial launch. The asteroids Tikkanen had created looked better than what any other game had showed, and the tunnel-like wormhole sections were the final piece of the puzzle. A major code rewrite was done prior to the release, and only the pre-rendered graphics remained from the first playable version. The core game mechanics were streamlined, and the original, more tactical vision was shaped into a reaction-based shooter. Around the same time, another Finnish team named Terramark released their first game for Amiga. Elfmania was a 2D beat-em-up. The reception was mixed, which led to poor sales. After the Elfmania was finished, Terramark started to work with a game titled PID, Private Investigator Dollar Rally, which would have been a light version of the first Grand Theft Auto. The game was axed mid-development due to the demise of Commodore. Because of this, Amiga was no longer a viable platform and folks at Terramark had to devise another plan. There were talks if PID should be ported to PlayStation, but the studio founder, Finnish game development legend Stavros Fasolas, had had enough of game development and called it quits. In December 1994, another Terramark founder, Ilari Kuittinen, got together with Bloodhouse lead Harri Tikkanen. They ended up betting on PC platform. Bloodhouse had a few PC titles in production, and so did folks at Terramark. In 1995, Terramark and Bloodhouse fused into Housemarque, the first Finnish game company. The first title to roll out under the Housemarque brand was the PC port of Super Stardust in 1995. Bloodhouse was responsible for the Amiga version, while Terramark came in for the PC port. The asteroid-inspired game was pretty much picture-perfect, with pristine pre-rendered graphics that remain impressive even today. Despite the meager resolution, the game is still a sight to behold, and it even has a booming soundtrack to match. The prefix Super tells you pretty much everything. The core might be the same as before, but there's just more of everything built around it. The game looks and sounds better than its predecessor. The fluid and detailed graphics really shine on PC, thanks to the color palette and performance edge over the Amiga. After the Super Stardust was released in 1995, the series went silent for 12 years and Housemarque concentrated on other games. However, the evolution on game development that started with Amiga continued on. AAA titles demanded more and more resources, and it became harder and harder for mid-sized game studios to survive in the market. Housemarque was developing a third-person action game for PlayStation 2. It was never successfully pitched to publishers, as everyone was looking at the next generation of consoles. Housemarque had spent large amounts of money for this big-budget title, and then the console generation changed. The lifeline was found in 2005 when digital distribution became popular, thanks to Valve and Steam. Soon the console manufacturers followed. Housemarque had made a deal with Sony, which resulted in the release of Super Stardust HD in 2007. The core gameplay of the HD edition is similar to the predecessors, but it's modernized just the right way. Rather than exiting the screen and re-emerging from the other side, the camera is lowered to an orbit of a planet. Ship stays in the center of the screen and the rest of the screen color revolves around the main point of focus. According to Ilari Kuittinen, Harri Tikkanen got the idea of remaking Stardust for consoles. The idea was to cram the screen full of stuff and move the gameplay closer to the surface of a planet. This was the starting point for the development. Super Stardust HD was a commercial success and critically acclaimed arcade masterpiece. Housemarque decided to concentrate on digitally distributed arcade games, and in a sense they became the ambassadors of shoot-'em-up games. Super Stardust HD was ported to PlayStation 4 and it received support for the PSVR. The cosmic battlegrounds work well in virtual reality, and the game benefits from the VR goggles, as there's nothing to steal away your attention. It's just you and the space rubble. Sadly, there's a bittersweet ending to the story. While Housemarque excelled in making these middle-budget and digitally distributed games, the audience for modern arcade games grew smaller and smaller. The last true arcade game released by Housemarque was Nex Machina, a true love letter for those of us who actually have physically went to the arcades. Designed in collaboration with arcade game legend Eugene Jarvis, Nex Machina is a worthy testament to a truly remarkable chapter in the history of Finnish game development. During the past few decades, Stardust has become the longest-running game franchise in Finland, and I refuse to believe that the recent PSVR port will be the last that we hear from the series. After all, Stardust endured 12 years of hibernation before making its way to PS3. As you can see, arcade never dies. And in my opinion, there's always room for games that are easy to learn but difficult to master. The popularity of Dark Souls, for example, speaks for itself. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to play something that'll probably drive me insane. But hey, that's what arcade games are all about. And as usual, the race was hard and tire was bad. Until next time, Vuorikoski out.